Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a nice break. So the past couple of panels, we've been really thinking about women in science in more of a historical context. And we'll be moving this afternoon to think about how a lot of the themes and topics that we've talked about both yesterday and this morning continue into the present. To lead us in this conversation for panel 5, which is on persistent problems, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leslie Aiello, who is also involved with shaping this conference, and I'm really indebted to her and all that she's done to support me and this program. Leslie is President Emerita of the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, as well as Professor Emerita at the University College of London. Her academic interests focus on the evolution of human adaptation, as well as the broader issues of evolutionary theory, life history, energetics, and the evolution of the brain and cognition. She has served as an officer for a number of anthropological and scientific societies, is also currently on the board of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and also as a consultant and advisor to a variety of international anthropological institutions and initiatives. She is also an APS member, and I like to think now a good friend. So I'm very happy to have Leslie here, and she's done many, many other things that I won't list now, but if you haven't had a chance to talk with her, she's really a powerhouse individual. So this session, we are going to have somebody who's presenting via Zoom, hopefully, if we can get it to work. I think we'll start with the two presenters who are here, and I'll let Leslie take it from here. So thank you all for coming back, and thank you, Leslie.
Okay, well, hi, everybody. And we're going to be talking about persistent problems. And we're having the persistent problem with zooming in our speaker from the Czech Republic. So, but what I want to do before we start is just give a brief introduction to all the speakers. Now, the fellow we're having trouble zooming in is Samuel Uwim, and he took together with his collaborator, who is Elizabeth Umo, originate from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And together they were going to give us insights on difficulties of African women scientists. Now, Samuel is an assistant professor now at the University of Hradec Kraków in the Czech Republic. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Before joining the University of Hradec Kraków, Samuel was a lecturer, tutor, and researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He also teaches sustainable development, African politics, and women in politics. Samuel is a member of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, and an Alumni Institute of Security Studies, and in Nairobi, Kenya. His research focuses on governance, democratic institutions, migration, women, and higher education. I was going to say our second speaker, but she's going to be speaking first since we are having trouble with Samuel. Sally Horrocks. Sally is Associate Professor in Contemporary British History at the University of Leicester in the UK and Senior Academic Advisor to the National Life Stories. She has a long-standing interest in the history of women and gender in science and engineering, which started with her undergraduate dissertation on Jane Marset's Conversations in Chemistry. She's a past president of the British Society for the History of Science, and in 2022 was the Wheeler Lecturer for the Royal Society of Chemistry Historical Group. And our third speaker is Nuala Krivak. It's Gaelic. She's Irish. And Nuala is a PhD candidate in the history department at New York University. Her research focuses on the relationship between science, climate change, and international conservation law. By focusing on Madagascar, she aims to make visible the social and scientific impact of the three bodies of botanical knowledge: Malagasy, Ecological and Evolutionary, on conservation ideology, policy, and practice. As an evolutionary biologist at the American Museum of Natural History, Nuala focuses on the theoretical phylogenetics. So, Jeremy in the back, do we have Samuel yet? Okay, well, we'll start with Sally then.
Good afternoon, everybody. Do gesticulate wildly if you can't hear me, because ironically, for someone who works with oral history, I've been having a lot of problems with my own voice recently. Like everyone else, huge thanks to the organisers of this conference for putting it together, and to all the speakers so far who've really inspired me, so much so that I'm reading off my laptop because I've tweaked my talk to take account of things that people have already said today. I should also say that the ideas in this paper are very much developed in collaboration with Paul Merchant, who's also one of the interviewers on the National Life Stories Oral History of British Science project. So he deserves as much credit for what I'm going to say as I do, but I should take all of the blame. Our paper argues for the importance of paying attention to the significance of emotional labour and management of feeling to the careers of women in science. We argue that thinking about emotions and feelings about work enables us to understand better the choices made by women scientists faced with hostile working environments, institutional barriers, and exclusions. These challenges need to be seen as emotional as well as structural, and overcoming them required significant labour that has remained hitherto largely unacknowledged, although it has been alluded to in many papers over the last day or so. While our material is drawn from the British context, we are confident that this overall observation is more widely applicable. This attention to the subjective dimensions of scientific work, that is, how people felt about their work and what it meant to them both at the time and in the context of recalling these events, is possible thanks to the availability of an extensive collection of life story interviews with scientists carried out by National Life Stories since 2010. These interviews can be seen as extended audio biographies recorded over multiple sessions and covering all aspects of the interviewee's life and work. The longest total over 20 hours. Rather than just using the interviews as a source of information about events, we listen to detect past experiences of emotion and emotions experienced during the interview itself. Listening is central, and the rendering of extracts from interviews into written form does not do justice to the richness of the information they contain about emotion. For this reason, I'm going to use most of this presentation to share some of the extracts on which the analysis is based with you. We focus on three ways in which interviews manage their feelings, although there are many others that we could have written about. When embarking on and remaining in a scientific career, navigating everyday workplace cultures, and issues of career progression and promotion. Interviewees' recollections of their decisions to study science and then enter scientific employment reveal the emotional labour often required to challenge norms and expectations, and the feelings that evoked in them by the perceived mismatch between feminine norms and expectations and their enthusiasm for science. This was particularly acute for those women who chose to have children, and meteorologist Julius Lunn, who started her family in 1980, recalled. Can we have the first clip?
My first daughter was born in December 1980, and I left the office in September expecting to be a housewife and mother. That was what people did those days. I mean, there were very few women in the office anyway, and certainly only a handful of us in research, and it was just not expected that you would return to work. So I left and tried to become a housewife and a mother, and had a go at it for about a year, and realised that actually I wasn't very good at it. My first daughter.
Like Slingo, astronomer, physicist, and later computer scientist Mary Almond, whose children were born in the mid-1950s, also found it difficult spending time with other mothers.
There was nothing for the women to do. Shell didn't employ the women on principle, and seeing as you were miles from anywhere else, there was women stewing in their own juice, as somebody said. Coffee mornings. Oh, and they ran a special bus. That was at Shell, the Essex one, into the nearest, town, Grays, so we could do some shopping once a week. Horrible it was.
And I think that clip shows us the importance of the silences as well as what is spoken within these interviews. And for both women, far from providing them with the anticipated emotional satisfaction, full-time motherhood had led to distress and discomfort and a rejection of many of the norms of feminine interaction embraced by their peers. For them, the emotional cost of not doing science proved greater than anticipated and eventually began to outweigh those extracted by doing it. Both came to realise that doing science could also be a source of emotional satisfaction and return to long careers in science. We'll move on now to think about workplace culture.
There was nothing.
Women regularly felt and were made to feel that they did not belong, forcing them to manage feelings of rejection and inadequacy. This involved direct discrimination, but also constant examples of what we now call microaggressions. Their survival strategies required balancing the pleasure and satisfaction they got from their work against the effort required to manage these feelings generated by unwelcoming work environments. Interview accounts suggest an awareness at the time and in hindsight of the additional stress that had been caused by this, and of often being the only woman in a male-dominated workplace. And this is very clear in this extract from the interview with computer scientist Shirley, which I quoted in the introduction to the written paper.
And it was quite exciting because the big one, because when I first walked in there, about 200, handsome, intelligent men turned round and looked at this new female that had sort of turned up. So, and that, took. It was quite, it was almost scary to go into a big place like that, not quite 100%, but 99% men. And as the years have gone, I've sort of got used to it and can give as good as I get, but from the management point of view, it's always much better to have a group of women rather than a sole woman trying to break into the board or whatever it is, because the stress is just so high. And also, if you're the only one, if you fail for all women. And they say, oh, we tried one of those and she was awful. Whereas if you succeed, it's also remembered, but somehow the presumption is that we had her and she was good. At least we'll try another one and see if it works again. Yeah. Sexism is not quite as bad as anti-Semitism, but it's pretty tough.
And that last remark needs to be put in the context that Shirley first came to Britain in the 1930s on a kinder transport. This strategy to accept what was being offered rather than challenging the status quo is also explained by the perceived risks of being labelled as a difficult woman, where, to draw on our discussions yesterday, women carefully calibrated their level of visibility on this issue. Polymer scientist Julia Higgins, who was born in 1942, acknowledged this when she reflected on the timing of her decision to become actively involved in campaigning activities. I'm just going to stick... Okay, go for that last one. Can we play the clip.
You could not, in engineering and physics, be unaware of the fact there weren't very many of us. I think there had been only one female professor of physics in the whole country. So I was very aware of it, but I was very chary about getting involved in sort of grassroots movements. Let's do something about women in science. Because in my view, you can't do anything from grassroots about something like that. You need something from the top. And then I suppose around about the time after I became professor, it became more obvious. And when I became FRS, it was pretty obvious. This business about being untouchable. I could go and talk to people. It wasn't, my career wasn't at stake. So I think it does refer a little bit back. I don't think I immediately thought, I'm untouchable, I can do things that will upset people, but it's a little bit part of that. And I got involved with a couple of things, and quickly it became obvious that by using that position, I could actually start things moving. Not me alone, but I could add it.
Overall, this paper argues that attending to the emotional labour required of women to enter and remain in science adds an important dimension to our understanding of their career choices, complementing our understandings of the structural barriers they faced. It draws attention to how these were experienced and navigated and the emotional labour required to do so. Women who remained in science were able to do so because for them at the time, the pleasure and satisfaction they got from their work and their uncertainty about what a life outside science would mean for them outweighed the energy they had to expend managing their difficult feelings. Managing these feelings led them to make decisions about whether and when to remain in workplaces that felt hostile and unwelcoming, and caused them to invest time and effort in developing strategies to improve their situation and manage these tensions. The vividness of their memories many decades later draws attention to how these events, the negative emotions they generated, and a strong sense of injustice remained long afterwards. In future work, we hope to explore in more detail the implications of this analysis for processes of knowledge production in science and for the way in which women access credit for their work. Thank you.
Enola.
Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good. Oh my God, it's such an honor to be here. So thank you so much to the American and the bell. Thank you for the bell for the American Philosophical Society, and thank you to Adriana and Jeremy and Thomas for putting this conference together. It's absolutely amazing. So this essay emerged when I came across a 2016 Nature online forum where the molecular gerontologist Laura Hoops asked who counts as a female scientist, 2016, and who decides who counts. Hoops offered the reader 4 categories to choose from. The first being only bench scientists should count. The second, I'd count bench scientists and administrators for research, not research policy workers or biographers. 3, I think if you're doing anything to do with science, you should be counted. So policy, yes. Biographies of scientists, yes. Science writing, yes. Administration of research, yes. You're lost in the field if you write murder mysteries or teach in a non-science discipline. And 4, I don't know what to think about this issue. I'm confused. I could just leave it there. In the comments section, readers place themselves within her artificial schema with the majority split between number 1 and 3. Comments turn towards the university system as the arbiter of who counts as a female scientist. The core issue commentators agreed upon was not who is a scientist, but what is perceived as success in science, with some participants arguing that the culture of high prestige is tied to tenured professorships at research-orientated academic institutions. An associate for Women in Science participant asserted that, and I quote, "It is about perception, role models, and being admitted into what had been a closed fraternity, not about what any individual wants to do," end quote. Another participant agreed, saying that it is about, and I quote, how we as a culture define status and success. Those definitions change very slowly." End quote. This very short form held academic institutions within an old boys club mentality and culture accountable for setting the gold standard for who counted as a female scientist. Most notable was the lack of critique over the bias and boundary making of Hoop's multiple choice answers. Participants quickly placed themselves within the options, yet commented that it was scientific output within elite institutions that created the metric of who counted as a female scientist. The familiarity of a multiple choice questionnaire triggers, in all of us, the impulse to locate ourselves within the answers offered. This kind of genre is an example of what the philosopher Ian Hacking has termed the creation of kinds among the masses. That the creator and participants do not question the artificial nature of the survey reveals the process of collective category mapping, as self-identity variously overlaps and competes with cultural and institutional attempts at defining women in science as a new kind of people. For this essay, I utilized a Hoop survey as a framing device to extend our question by asking what counts as a female scientist. And this whole session has been so amazing, this whole conference, to try and understand this. And here I use the term woman or female in the most capacious fashion. If you identify as a woman, you are a woman. So for this, I considered 4 scientists in the field of biology and biochemistry over 60 years to think through this question. Rachel Carson, Lynn Margulies and Vicky Funk, and Jennifer Doudna. My paper aims to historicize the multiple ways women in science have to be 1, ungendered, degendered, and regendered, and not necessarily in that order, and 2, rebranded as innovators, rebels, or entrepreneurs to not be considered scientists by their male counterparts. I argue that what counts as a female scientist within the fields of biology and biochemistry is one that does not aim to theorize. Theorizing about the natural and physical world remains the rarefied air of the few, mostly white male scientists. So for the rest of this talk, I just want to share some of the highlights, the highlight reel of this sort of exploratory exercise. First, scientific attributes are always up for grabs. Rachel Carson, her Silent Spring generated a firestorm of controversy following its publication in 1962. Her book revealed the environmental impact of using synthetic pesticides, such as DDT. Her opponents, many of them connected to the lucrative pesticide industry, felt attacked and began to lean heavily on rhetoric that marginalized Carson or denied her scientific status. Her lack of a PhD or academic affiliation and work as a nature writer enabled her opponents to argue that she was not a bench scientist. Lynn Margulies, her theory of endosymbiosis, published in 1967, rewound the evolutionary clock to 4 billion years as she declared war on the view that competition was the only force behind evolutionary change. Opponents to her work primarily aimed to question her role as a scientist. They were quick to point out that her paper presented no original research data. Was she even a microbiologist, they asked. Vicky Funk was a botanist and curator at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History. Her use of cladistic methodologies, a novel approach to reconstruct evolutionary history on the species of the tree of life, left her being criticized for her scientific inventions as being sloppy and non-scientific. Jennifer Doudna and her colleague Emmanuelle Charpentier deciphered the inner workings of a bacterial immune system called CRISPR-Cas9. They won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2020. Doudna, a biochemist by training, was considered an innovator, a biotechnological genius, and a methodologist, not necessarily a scientist. Second, gendered rhetoric is a persistent feature applied to women in science as an attempt to distance them from the category of scientist and science. The conflation of the personal and the intellectual is a central component of being considered a woman in science. Carson's book was an emotional and an inaccurate outburst, said Time magazine. She was accused of being a communist, a bird and bunny lover, a hysterical female, a spinster, so why was she worried about genetics? Margulies was portrayed as a very rebellious and obnoxious scientist who threatened the objectivity, order, and rationality of the scientific advance. Critics and colleagues often claimed she was pugnacious, loud, rude, and in your face as a scientist. Funk was accused of being too assertive and fearless, asexual and sharp. She was not female enough, or rather female in a form not acceptable to her male colleagues. Doudna is a woman in science and a role model for women. As the historian Evelyn Fox-Keller has noted, the degree to which our understanding of feminine and scientific have been historically constructed in opposition to each other. Scientific or non-scientific are not static ideas, but perceptual categories in the public and scientific mind. This very small table, I have a bigger data table behind this. This small table provides ample evidence for Steve Shapin's argument that the persistence of the personal in judging science is inseparable from the research and institute itself. It continues today. And last, in the field of biology, the category of theory and experiment are carefully reinforced. Carson and Margulis arguably made theoretical interventions and were derided for it. Funk and Doudna stayed at flying altitude, working beneath the space of theory, and therefore were more acceptable as female scientists. So to conclude, the exploratory exercise of what counts as a female scientist within these fields highlights the murky waters, vacillating spaces, and patriarchal bent of defining what a woman in science is. What counts as a female scientist is historically contingent, which sounds very obvious to say. One cannot begin to say, someone like Mary Somerville, Maria Sibylla Merian, and map a progressive march toward equality and equity and a normalization of scientists being female across all STEM fields. The threshold and parameters are ever shifting as an artifact that both science and capitalism were historical institutions that arose in an imperial ideological context of global exchange and whose entanglement has been continuously remade. The adaptability of the scientific enterprise within capitalistic and scientific logics relies on continuous labor, both invisible and visible, to produce knowledge about the natural world. What counts as a female scientist is contingent on the complex forces of scientific capitalistic cultures. Thank you so much.
Okay, and let's check in on Samuel. Jeremy, do we have him? Nope.
Well, I think, why don't we move to a Q&A of the two papers that we've heard from, and then if he appears, we'll see what we can do. So if you want to offer some initial reflections, remarks, Leslie, and then we're gonna go with it.
Okay, we can look at it as being very positive, that we have much more time to discuss. And sitting here, I have to confess that I'm not a historian. I'm an anthropologist. And I was thinking about our conversations of the last day and a half in relation to my own field and my own career. Some of you may not be familiar with anthropology, but it's always been a very female discipline. And all you have to do is think about Mary Leakey, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey. The social anthropology side, we have Margaret Mead, a very well-known public intellectual, as well as numerous other female social scientists. And one of the reasons for this, particularly in social anthropology, it's that it was recognized by our male colleagues very early on that there were certain parts of society that weren't open to males. And this is what one of the reasons females were accepted on a relatively equal ground in the field, going way back to the beginning of the discipline. But this isn't to say that there's been no gender bias at all in the field. And thinking back in my own history, I was an undergraduate in the early 1960s. And one of the points that was made yesterday was the instances of stabbing in the back. And I actually experienced this from my PhD supervisor, who wasn't 100% supportive of me as I was a PhD student. Not necessarily because I was a woman, but because I wasn't medically qualified. My PhD was in anatomy from the University of London. And I had put in a book proposal for a major reference book on evolutionary anatomy. And he was asked by the publisher to review my proposal. And he said I wasn't capable of it. And even he, as a professor of anatomy, wouldn't be capable of it. And this book was published in 1990. It's still in print, and it's become a classic in the field. And no, I'm extremely proud of it. But there's a moral to the story, and that is that you can't, you have to really forge on and not let things like this happen to you. It also happened again on the administrative side. When I took over as being head of department in London, my male predecessor, his parting words to me was, don't make any important decisions without consulting me. And I sort of laughed at him and went on and got a brand new building for the department. When I took over, we were the worst housed department out of 72 departments in the whole university by any metric you'd want to make. But as a segue into what I hope the discussion will move into, one of the most egregious things in my field was a friend of mine who was a PhD student at one of the major universities in this country. And she had a very supportive supervisor until he found out that she was not a lesbian. And he expected her to follow from a train of single female archaeologists who had made quite an impact in the field. And his attitude was, well, if you aren't a lesbian, you're going to have a family, and it's a waste of my time to train you. And this happened in the 1960s. And it's something that, from our perspective, of course, is totally egregious. But it brings up an issue that we really haven't talked about in this conference yet, and that is the work-life balance that tends to affect female scientists more than our male counterparts. When I was head of department, I used to tell my young female faculty that it's impossible for me to promote you for having a family, but I can do everything in my power to make it possible for you to have a reasonable work-life balance, that you can carry out your research and you can carry out your teaching requirements and all. But it's something, if we're talking about persistent problems in the field, and a problem that extends across all STEM disciplines, it's how females can navigate a scientific career at the same time as making significant contributions to the scientific discipline. And I was quite taken by Nuala's paper and some of her comments about how female scientists were perceived as being aggressive, being unfeminine. I mean, you probably can come up with all the adjectives better than I can. And with the emotional side of it as well, of how we can actually navigate successfully and develop women in science as we move through the 21st century, to allow us to balance our lives with the fertility clock ticking away at us. I have another young friend now who has a teaching position at a very high-level university, who suddenly realized she's 40 years old, and she's devoted herself entirely to her discipline. And she's now going through a fertility crisis where she's decided that she has to become a single parent. And it's extremely distressing to her at the moment of how she can possibly balance her passion in science with her passion of wanting to become a parent. So what I'd like to do is ask, both Sally and Nuala to reflect on these issues of whether this is the main persistent problem we have, or whether there are other problems that may or may not overshadow it.
Yeah. I'll just make a few comments about work-life balance in the interview collection that I'm drawing upon, because I think it's worth sharing that with this audience, that most of the people we interviewed were men, but we obviously interviewed quite a lot of women as well. But we also asked the men about the impact of having children on their careers. Many of the older men particularly were quite surprised to be asked questions. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Quite surprised to be asked those kind of questions, and were a little bit reticent about answering them, especially to much younger men who were interviewing them. But what came out there was that most of them had left the work to their wives. One notorious, in my mind, interviewee said, "That's what I kept a wife for." But also that it turned out that many of them had, at least the way they presented themselves in the interview, sought to remedy this as grandparents, and were much more hands-on with their grandchildren than they had been with their own children, because they recognized the positive contribution they could make to their daughters' careers or the wives of their sons, in all cases, doing this. But we did have one example of someone who had children in the 50s, who had 6 children, who completely changed his research agenda so that he could not be rushing off to Africa on expeditions, but doing geography fieldwork that could be done with his young family. So, we have at least that one example of a man seeking to balance career with children as well. But it is a persistent problem, and I think, or a persistent challenge for women in science. And I think one of the things that we need to look at here is different regimes in different countries around childcare, because I have a sort of undeveloped theory that certainly in the UK, one of the resistances to more provision of childcare was the perception that in the Soviet Union they did that, and women in the Soviet Union were not allowed to be women, and so having provision of childcare was something that was a place we shouldn't be going. And it's interesting that there's been much more childcare available, certainly in the UK after 1990, than there was before. So I think putting women's work in science in that wider context of women's professional work in the wider social and cultural environment is really important, because it's not just about women in science, it's about lots of other women in lots of areas of work, and we should be thinking about women in science in that context as well as the scientific context, that we maybe tend to put them in more firmly than that other context.
Thanks so much for these comments. I have so much I want to say, but I'll try to keep it concise, which is really hard because I'm Irish. That's my excuse for talking along.
You have lots of time.
I might just break out into a song. You never know. I think what's really interesting to me is looking at men in science versus women in science and the type of scientific attributes that they have. Right. So if in my case, a lot of my historical actors have PhDs and they're male, and no one questions that. And it's always up for grabs with a female, just across the board, even when they have a PhD, when they have these higher degrees. What's really fascinating to me is how the non-scientific attributes get part and play out within these stories. And what you'll see is that with women are just caught between these sort of vacillating spaces between femininity and masculinity and how they're placed at any point in time, versus a lot of the men that I work with, because I work a lot with botanists, both living and dead, and a lot of them are queer or gay, and there's a really interesting way that they're reconfigured as scientists, even if they're considered quote-unquote feminine by their colleagues. So that to me was always so striking, how a woman's personhood in every sense was up for grabs in a way that men's weren't. And then just on the other one about persistent problems, one thing I'm working through, so my dissertation's actually set in Madagascar, and it's interesting how, in looking at how do you get your elbows at the table. And so to get your elbows at the table, you have to kind of perform in a certain way. So a lot of countries in Africa and Madagascar are trying, understandably so, to get their elbows at the table, at the international table, when it comes to, say, things like conservation policy. And to do that, they have to replicate the certain forms of the way that the undergrad, the way the education system is, the way that you travel through those spaces to get a PhD. And so the context of what they bring knowledge-wise or their own, culture, it has to be erased for them to actually be seen. And I find that really difficult in meetings to not want to be like, this doesn't have to be the gold standard, but it is the gold standard that we're all sort of playing with, and sort of this, patriarchal system that we're in. So something I think about a lot. And then I work at the American Museum of Natural History with a lot of students that come from urban settings from New York. And it's interesting seeing kids from an urban setting, and I'm using coded language here because urban setting is basically saying New York is made up of diverse students, and so urban is a way of saying black and brown students. It's not something I'm very comfortable with, but I want to introduce it to the way that we assume that whiteness and being a white scientist is the way you're supposed to perform, and to see students struggle with trying to figure out how to behave in these spaces, which I completely disagree with, but it's such a strong force to work against. So thank you for these questions.
So,
Okay, Shirley, are there questions from the audience?
or since we have a little time, if others, since we do have some scientists in the room, if others, okay, we'll go to Dan and wave at me. I'm here for you.
Thank you. I'll just stand up so I can see. So I have a question, or I have a couple of methodological questions for Sally. I guess the first question is just kind of generally what your methodology is for working with oral history sources. But then a little bit more specifically, you had mentioned that when you were using these, you were kind of simultaneously looking at how the subjects are talking about the emotional aspects of things that happened in the past, but also kind of what their emotions are during the interview. And so I was just wondering if there are ever any situations that are ambiguous or where it isn't entirely clear what the emotional state or, sort of how to classify that, basically. And then finally, for those of us who don't work with oral history sources, are there ways of trying to get at some of these emotional experiences and emotional burdens from sources that maybe don't explicitly address this?
Great, three great questions there. So in terms of methodological, it's worth saying that some, but not all the interviews that we work with have got detailed content summaries where the interviewer, after the interview, has created a list of kind of topics. So it's almost like an index to the interview, which includes time codes. So those can be used to identify parts of the interview where relevant issues around emotions were discussed. And then you can go in and listen to those sections. I guess the crucial thing to say about the methodology is even when we've got transcripts, we focus on listening rather than just looking at the written word, because the questions that people have been asked are very open questions that can lead into the reflection. So the extract from Stephanie Shirley's interview that I played was a response to a question, which canteen did you eat in? So that's not obviously going to be a question that evokes a lot of reflection on feelings about work, but in fact, her reflections kind of lead in that way. So in an ideal world, you would listen to the whole interview, but when there's 20 hours of it, that's quite a time-consuming thing to do. So it is a question of kind of homing in on particular bits. I've not personally done the interviews, but when I had a PhD student who was doing her own interviews, what she actually did was when she was producing her content summaries, also highlighted sections where these issues came up. So she could then go back and listen to them. But it is, I think, one of the big challenges with working with oral history, not just in history of science, but generally, is the volume of data that you've actually got. Some of the transcripts for these interviews are double the length of a PhD. It's a huge volume of data. And I think one of the things I sometimes find frustrating is people are assuming you're working with an hour's length interview and that you haven't got huge amounts of data when actually you've got a vast amount of data, and so it needs processing. So it is about using the tools that we've got to index the interview, to identify relevant sections, and then very much listening to them, not just dealing with the transcript. And there's also a big debate about whether you should be videoing people or just collecting the sound. And our approach is just to collect the sound, partly because interviewing for archiving and then sharing, if you have video, it's a massive amount of bandwidth for storing and for delivering, and it makes it much less accessible to a global audience if you need much better internet connections to download video to access any material. But also very often it's just someone sitting in front of a bookshelf, and the amount of emotion that you can get from that sort of presentation of a video interview isn't necessarily a lot more than you can get from listening. It's about listening to the audio cues. I think I alluded in the presentation to the silences and the pauses. And I think that's really important in terms of the strongest sections for this kind of topic are where people pause a lot and you can actually tell that they're thinking as they're speaking. And there's a kind of a processing of those past experiences in the moment of the interview with those pauses to speak. And I think that partly answers your question about the emotional states. I wouldn't claim, I may be misreading what's going on in these interviews. I have to accept that. These are my interpretations of what's going on. Sometimes there are clues. One woman we've written about in the past has said things like, I was so stupid to do that. I shouldn't have done that. So she's being very self-critical, and that's very revealing. But very often it's a question of people talk about much more about feelings than emotions. And you need to look out for words like cross or angry or surprised, but they won't necessarily express emotion in those ways. So it is, in a way, readings. People were not asked directly. They were often asked, how did something feel? Which is a way of starting to get at those kind of questions. In terms of how you do this with other sources, I think letters and diaries sometimes can reveal some of that, and some of the material people have shown already in this conference have revealed people's emotions within those kind of personal sources. But if you've mainly got, you might even get in lab notebooks in the exhibition, there's someone where, I forgot to put in the neutralization. That's a kind of self-critical, emotional moment in the lab, I think. Shit, I did that. But it is more tricky in other sources. And I guess the last point I'd make here is that I think it's really great. Oral history can be used in history of science more than we have done so far to get at these other aspects of scientific work that other sources just can't allow us to talk about. And rather than worrying about the factual accuracy of oral history, which is something I don't worry about at all, I'm interested in what people choose to tell us and how they say it, and the priority they give to different memories tells us about the importance of those events in the past to them. It's not about, so what happened, yeah, but it's how you remember what happened and what it means to you that I'm most interested in as an oral historian. And it's, all oral historians kind of revere Alessandro Portelli's work on this in terms of what makes oral history different. And I think history of science is almost a bit late in catching up. I mean, Ron Dole was here earlier. I think he's gone, but he urged us to do this quite a while ago now. And we need to pick up much more on his injunctions.
Okay. I think this methodology question is really interesting, but as a historian, I'm interested in what the outcomes are, sort of what you've really learned by doing this. And I'm thinking, as you're identifying these emotional points, are there certain things that have stood out? In other words, I saw childbearing, possibly I saw discrimination and irritation about the discrimination. I'm curious whether there are other points that kind of came up. These are reminiscences. So what have these respondents, oral historian that you're interviewing, these people you're interviewing, what have they seen? Is there a pattern? I mean, or do you say everyone's so different that the crises or the points at which they become emotional are really so individual you can't say that? As a historian, you were asking how is this useful, and I thought if we know from your cases what late 20th century women, in this case, worried about, as we're doing our own research on that period, we may be able to learn what to look for or what to anticipate. So I'm curious what you might draw out of your research in terms of the crises points, which strikes me where the emotion comes up.
I think going into science in the first place is one kind of critical thing, especially with the kind of perceived mismatch between femininity and science. In the written paper, there was the example of Barbara Bowen, who wanted a job in science but didn't want to make holes in her tights, for example. But I think something that it wasn't in the paper but which is worth highlighting is the extent to which women so often suppressed their own needs in order to accommodate the needs of other people they were working around. And we chose not to write about them here because we've written about that previously, and that would be the one thing I would say. So often women are subordinating their own needs to those of other people and kind of managing the well-being of other people around them, mainly men very often, in order to kind of keep the peace and to have a harmonious workplace environment. I think a kind of overall hypothesis, which we're still not sure if this is really true or not, is women worried about whether they had a place in there at all, and men worried about their place in the hierarchy. And so that, if you want one thing to take away, I think that might be it. And I guess the interesting question is, what is the point at which women stop worrying about whether they belong there at all and start worrying about where they fit in the hierarchy?
So I have 3 questions on the floor in 4 minutes. So I think I'm going to have to, unfortunately, take the 3, and we'll have time for conversation in the break.
And I'll just very quickly verify and commend Sally for what she was talking about.
I'm going to hold it for you.
Okay, for oral history methodology. And it is that you don't ask like focused questions. You open up a topic And what they choose to say within that topic and how they choose to say that tells you so much more. And there's a tremendous literature on analyzing oral histories. You go to the Oral History Association and you look at their resources, and they have a massive website on this. And you can find all sorts of writing about how to analyze this. Abrams has an edited volume on it. I've actually been interviewing women in science since 1975. And it really varies what the different points of view are. And some women just become one of the boys, and some women really struggle with those roles. And it has a lot to do with the men that they work with, and whether there are other women there. I've had older men reflect back on their regrets that they didn't spend time with their children. Right? Yeah, they really have, and that they should have, and they're spending time with the grandchildren now. But if they, one guy said, you know, what was, you know, your greatest non-success during your career? And he said that I didn't spend more time with my wife and family. And I truly regret that now. And there are men who will say that out loud. So you can't predict. I mean, there's tremendous variety in human personalities. But oral history is a tool where you can start to get answers like that and see things about people you're not going to see any other way. So I do recommend it, and there are just caches of these things all over the place for people to really find out what's going on. But keep going.
Thanks very much. I was going to ask Sally a question, but it might have in large part just been answered. But my question relates to the comment about how oral histories tell you so much about what the person chooses to talk about, and yet so much does depend on what questions are asked. And so then the issue becomes, what is your philosophy about how to deal with the interviewee before the interview takes place to decide what questions might be appropriate to be asking? I like this, I think it's Pamela, is Pamela? I like Pamela's comment about how you open the door and then they can talk about whatever they want. But Sally, I was just asking you that question about, is that your philosophy also?
Let's do one more question in here, and yeah, I apologize. There's so many questions, but we're sort of out of time. So we're going to do one more, and then I'm going to encourage folks in the break to make a new friend. Talk to someone you haven't talked to today. Ask a question.
Thank you. I have a question for Norla. I really like your presentation, and the three women scientists were like framed as asexual and unwomanly, like the honorary man in science. On the other hand, like Evelyn Fox Keller wrote a biography of McClintock, like Feeling the Organism, and described her way of doing a feminine science as esoteric and feeling and motherly and maternal way. However, McClintock, she herself, like disagreed, and she thinks like her intellectual sharpness is kind of like transcends gender in a neutral way. So my question is like, do you sense any like tension in our way of addressing women scientists' achievement?
Go for it.
Go for it. Okay. Just very quickly to answer the question to me, our interviews are life story interviews. So they start off by asking people about their childhoods and their education, and they go through the life course, and of which their career is part, but very often we go on into retirement as well. So because it's the extended form of oral history interview, it's not about deciding what to talk about, because you're covering that whole range of the life.
Such a good question. Barbara, as I call her, is a fascinating person herself. Yeah, I think that's always the struggle, that figuring out what your historical actors mean versus what you kind of hope to see in them. Certainly, with Lynn Margulis, she did not want to be considered a feminist. She didn't really push away the idea that what she was presenting in her theory of endosymbiosis was a feminine view of the world, a collaboration. She really adamantly was against that. So it is something that I think about as methodology. How do I frame how I'm talking about things, whether it's gender or, feminine or masculine versus what my actors are doing? But we can definitely talk more about it. It's a great question.
Yeah, I feel like this session, and also inspired by Chanel's work, that we should be taking oral histories of one another to put up somewhere in the wiki, universe or elsewhere, maybe at the APS. Who knows? So with that segue, thanks everyone for these wonderful questions. Thank you to this panel. We're going to take a half-hour break. So we'll be back at, I don't even know what time it is anymore, 2 o'clock. We'll be back at 2:30. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking these panelists for this fantastic presentation.